Welcome! Christ is risen! Christ is risen indeed. Happy Easter! And man, I'm with N.T. Wright. We should do 40 days of Easter and 3 days of Lent. Oh, church, we so miss the boat on Easter. It's not about cooked ham, not about pastel-colored decorations. It's not, gulp, not about warm hugs. It is, yes, it is, about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. He was a man who proclaimed himself to be the Son of God, and after having been crucified, the life excruciatingly sucked out of his lungs, after having been entombed, he arose and walked out of a Jerusalem tomb. And that event, you guys, that event changed all of history. And it certainly changed my history. We are ultimately destined for resurrection life, not ultimately heaven. Oh, thank you, Lord, for heaven. But folks believed in heaven before Jesus lived. The goal isn't finally heaven. Belief in heaven isn't why the church exploded across the continents. No, the goal is, and the reason the New Testament was written is, a man walked out of a Jerusalem tomb and told us that eternal life in resurrected bodies was our destiny too. And when I say that, I mean this body with a bald head and scars and wires and staples and plastic wedge inserts in my spine, my blue eyes, my 6'1" tall body, it's going to be resurrected for eternity. So, happy Easter. Christ is risen, risen indeed. Hallelujah. Quickly, my thanks to Isaiah Timothy and Matthew E.T. for your Apple Podcast reviews of the UU. By me, those are dearly appreciated. Folks, yes, thanks. Please go and leave a UU review on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Android, Odyssey, Boomplay, or even iHeartRadio. All of those are podcast apps where you can find the UU. Thank you. My show? Here's some of the what. When I started this podcast, I kind of figured people would see it as a go-to resource, a theological, biblical, historical, philosophical even, library. I mean, holy call number, Batman. I've done entire series on reason versus faith, science versus religion, Jesus in his first century milieu, the Bible and sexuality, God's Holy Spirit, the afterlife, resurrection, heaven, hell, thinking about writing a book on it. More science-y stuff, epistemology, the Reformed Arminian controversy, world religions, the spiritual world, from an ancient Jewish perspective, Trinity, the Summer of George, which I titled The Cult of the Now. I did a series on the human body and muchly more. It's been 7.5 years of me thinking out loud with you. I mean, today makes 413 episodes. So guys, please know there are many topics you can resource through UU Podcasts. Go to www.uncensoredunprofessor.com, and in the middle of the page you'll see a listing of all my shows by series. Or if you have a specific question, and I get those all the time, email me at uncensoredunprofessor@gmail.com and I'll send you a link to a specific show that'll address your particular question. I means to be your electronic Dewey Decimal resource. There's some of the what. Here's some of the why. Some of the why of my podcasting efforts. A 2022 survey of American pastors revealed that just slightly more than 1/3, 37%, possesses a biblical worldview, and the majority, 62%, hold a hybrid worldview known as syncretism. Now, this study was done at Arizona Christian University's Cultural Research Center under the leadership of renowned researcher George Barna. Head pastors embrace a Christian worldview at a higher percentage than do associates, 41% to 28%. And sorry, because I'm not remotely surprised, among youth pastors and children's pastors, they hold a paltry 13% to a biblical worldview. And I guess on both counts, associates and youth pastors, that bodes poorly for the future, right? Since it's youth pastors and associates who, in the future, become head pastors. Queso sagrado. Barna helped make my point. He said, quote, a person's worldview primarily develops before the age of 13, then goes through a period of refinement during their teens and 20s. Therefore, from a worldview development perspective, a church's most important ministers are the children's pastor and the youth pastor. And by the way, thank you, listener Bert H., for sending me this study. Barna said what I've been saying for over 5 years now. Culture is more powerful than the saltiness of the church. Me, back across my 25 years of teaching theology and other classes, I'd say I could usually in 4 to 6 weeks, I could discern the students in my class who had a defined Christian worldview from those who did not. And hear me carefully. I'm not talking about how bright by terms of sheer IQ or how articulate or charismatic a student was. I'm talking about whether in they reading notes, their exam scores, and their in-class remarks, whether they could express themselves from out of a well-formed Christian worldview. Did they approach issues and problems and matters from a Christian worldview or not? Were they Christian in their thinking, or were they American syncretists? Were they sculpted in the identity of Christ, or had they been programmed by the dominant scripts of postmodernity? Yeah, I could discern that. And me, I think society can discern that too. I think people realize when a believer has a something more, a quidditas, to use a philosophical term, there that's not normal American syncretistic goo barf. They may not like that something different is confronting them, but they can sense it. But let's go back to the 30,000-foot perspective. Why is having a Christian worldview more important than practicing a sentimental piety? Is having a Christian worldview ultimately about salvation? I don't know. I guess eventually that is at issue, yes. Now me, I won't pretend to be able to see the human heart the way God does. I mean, he's eternal judge, not me. So then why does it matter? Why does a Christian worldview matter? Because it goes to mission. Jesus called his own to mission. And following Christ is not just about being saved. It's just not. To follow the Nazarene is to take up his mission. And his mission is, he told us, his mission is to be salt and light. To represent the beauty, truth, mercy, grace, holiness, hope, life, love, resurrection of the King of God's kingdom, Yeshua Nazareth. His charge to us was, go be salt and light. Oh, but we can't be salt and light, or can't be that for long, apart from embracing and living inside a Christian worldview. Sure, like all human beings, we can produce one act of loving grace in a given moment. But we cannot, across the sweep of our lives, live in Christ's salt and light apart from embracing a biblical Christian worldview. There has to be more than simple emotional piety. There has to be more than Christian niceness. Niceness, as it's come to be known here in 2025, niceness is not one of the fruits of the Spirit. There has to be more than winsomeness to challenge a budding 21st century Christian virtue. Sheesh, Lucifer is, if needed, probably winsome. There has to be more than tenderness. Gulp, there has to be more than empathy. Tenderness is not the baseline for being a disciple. I know, right? No, to become and to be a Christian disciple, one simply must embrace and cherish and seek to pass on a Christian worldview. That we remain salt and light requires intentionality. Our ability to preserve, heal, speak, and model Jesus Christ requires more than a warm, heartfelt posture toward reality. And so, all of that to say, you, my listener, thanks for wanting to go a little deeper. Thanks for your hunger for truth, because that hunger is so rare today. I know I taught college and grad classes for 25 years, even a little bit of seminary. That hunger, that curiosity to dig deeper into the Christian faith, it is an enduring way to remain salt and light. Hey, thanks for joining me. It's been rewarding to see the interest in my Crusade series. The truth is, the West used to appreciate the Crusades for what they really were, right? I mean, colleges and schools all over the West took the name Crusaders, or Knights, as their mascot. And they wouldn't have done that unless they had admiration for Crusaders. But today, the Crusades are grotesquely maligned. I just saw a video online where the guy was like, well, the Crusades don't represent Christianity. I'm thinking, you haven't studied the Crusades. Against reigning secular memes, the Middle East had been Christian, and then it got invaded. Invaded as in massacred, gang raped, genocided. Invaded by Islam. That desecration finally, after some 400 years, provoked the Crusades. Egypt was completely Christian until the 640s. That means nearly 600 years. Syria was completely Christian until the early 700s. That means 700 years. Spain was almost entirely Christian until AD 711 when, as I talked last week, 80,000 Muslims invaded. I could keep going. The point is, Islam invaded and conquered regions all over the Middle East and Southern Europe. Allah's boys were the warrior culture. So Christianity had to respond, had to fight back. And the fighting back was, in part, the Crusades. But let's turn this toward the 21st century for a few moments. Does the Koran really teach jihad or not? Does the Koran really teach jihad or not? A modernist development is that Islam is a religion of peace. Islam means submit. Submit your soul to Allah and you will find peace. That's what's taught in the academy today. And with that, jihad. Jihad in this moderate spin or this moderate interpretation is a spiritual struggle. Sort of like a parallel to Christianity's dark night of the soul. If you'll just submit to the dark night of the soul, the dark night of Allah's inscrutable sovereignty, you'll find spiritual peace. And in Islam, if you'll surrender your soul to Allah in existential jihad, you will find peace. Islam is a religion of peace. And if you say otherwise in the classroom, you'll be criticized, accused, maybe even red-faced shouted at. Sheesh, if you say otherwise in Scandinavia or the UK, you may get yourself stabbed. Now me, I never had students yell at me to defend Islam, but I did have many who, initially anyway, I had many who thought it was impolite to talk about the spread of Islam as something accomplished by violence, something Muslims themselves called jihad. Well, some of my students thought I was being unfair until they began to plow through the required readings. Then they'd wander into class sobered up. They would say aloud, Muslims really did that to human beings? How could human beings do that to other human beings? Like I say, a little dose of history real sobered them up. So then, how to account for these two oppositional presentations of Islam? One that Islam only means to bring peace, jihad is spiritual, personal peace. The other, from 14 centuries of history, that Islam does offer peace if one submits, if one gives in, capitulates, bows the knee, shuts the mouth, forsakes the cross, wears the burqa. Why such variance between these two camps? It goes to hermeneutics. Allow me to explain. Across 14 centuries, the literalists, those Muslims who read the Koran literally, believed it was both Allah's and Muhammad's mission for them to jihad the world. There is the Ummah, the domain and community of the chosen people, Muslims, and there is the land of the Armies. Class, please say Armies. Armies, teacher. Armies are the inhabitants of the lands of war. Again, in Islam, Muslims are Allah's people, the Ummah, and non-Muslims are the Armies, those who live in the lands of war. Lands of war? Yes, the lands that Allah has yet to conquer. And because they've not yet been conquered, they are destined for war with Islam. So literalists, they took Muhammad's admonitions to jihad literally. The Armies must be conquered. Jihad, as we saw 2 weeks ago, jihad in this reading is Muslim piety. So when we see on TV or social media that Muslims are beheading people, Christians, Americans, Jews, they are literally obeying the Quran. When ISIS arose in Syria, are they still? I don't know. Muslims in Syria, non-fundamentalist Muslims, including Sufis. I watched a video the other day. They're deeply concerned that the new ISIS leader turned prime minister of Syria through a military coup is going to now enforce they're worried he's going to enforce a radical fundamentalist version of Islam. So this literalist camp, they were a Muslim apocalyptic movement dedicated to the literal fulfillment of the Quran, jihad, and domination of the entire world to the glory of Allah. On the flip side, there are those who say Islam is an internal jihad. They, and let's be clear, they're a minority, they read the Quran in metaphoric ways. They don't take the Quran's calls to jihad, warfare, in terms of military conquest, but more in terms of spiritual, soulish conquest. We must submit and tame our impulses. We must submit and live in humility. We should establish peaceful order in society. And this camp, well, it was served up mainstream to Christians by theologian Miroslav Volf at Yale. I had a class with him back in the 90s. No, not at Yale. He came out and taught at my seminary as a guest professor. But this camp represents, something like 1% of all Muslims ever. It is true that across the centuries there were fascinating philosophic theologic exchanges between Muslim, Jewish, and Christian philosophers, but that was rare. Those intellectual exchanges were frequently interrupted by jihad, raids, invasions, mass gang rape, and massacres. They were interrupted by open warfare, army versus army. But my point is here, whether Islam is literally an eternal war against Christianity, as Muhammad himself taught, or whether it's an internal struggle to overcome the self and selfishness and wickedness, all that depends on hermeneutics. How does one read and interpret the Quran? From whence to take one's cues? And frankly, my listener, moderate Muslims even today are slow to speak out regarding their spiritual, metaphorical, Quranic interpretations because they know that those upset literalist Muslims. So, me? I'll let you decide whether the first one, literal, open military jihad, or the other, spiritualized, soulish jihad, is the more prevalent today. Okay, at long last, the First Crusade. How to set the holy city of Jerusalem free. At the preaching behest of Pope Urban II and others, helpers, pleaders, some 10 different groups from across Europe, but primarily from Gaul and Germania, set out from the Holy Land. Among those were most famously Peter the Hermit's group. Now Peter was a peripatetic, which means not only wandering, but officially he didn't belong to a monastery. A peripatetic monk, ascetic from Cologne. And I mean, pause, time out, isn't that fascinating itself? A monk, ascetic, spiritual leader, leading an army? It calls to our mind questions about just what was the holy, the religious life in the medieval era. And just so you know, religious is a Catholic technical term for a recognized, ordained person who's given them their lives over to the ministry. Peter the Hermit, leading an army. It also calls to mind questions about pacifism. Thank you, Colleen, for probing me and asking me about that. Specifically, it raises questions about the just war tradition more broadly, and Jesus turned the other cheek ethic more specifically, and I think I'll delineate those topics next week. With Peter went 700 knights, 28,000 infantrymen. Some say it was 100,000, but that number's overblown. And along with them were assisting thousands of non-combatants, priests, cooks, bishops, stable boys. Many of these folks were peasant villagers who'd been swept up in the excitement of Crusader fever, owing to the fervent preaching of Urban II and Peter the Hermit himself. Then there was the group led by Walter the Penniless, and no, I'm not making up these names. He was also from Cologne. In fact, he was Peter the Hermit's friend. He and his military crew, his army, as they traveled, they had problems in Bulgaria. And as we'll go through all the Crusades, we'll see that Bulgaria is a common problem, a common pattern for those armies traveling southeast on their Crusades. But Walter's group wanted to buy supplies from the king of Niš, who told them no. Well, rather than starving, the Crusaders went out foraging and rounded up some local herds, which upset some Bulgarians to the point that they drove one foraging party into a church and burned the building, killing about 60 Crusaders. Now, Walter, what I think was an exercise of unusual wisdom, refused to retaliate. He knew that doing so would cost him still more soldiers and precious time. Then there were several princes from Gaul, France, and Germany, all of whom made great financial sacrifice to fund their Crusader campaigns. These included Hugh of Vermandois, also known in a backwards fashion, I can't explain it today, as Hugh the Great. He was anything but great. In fact, he was a particularly incapable leader who eventually watched as a predictable winter storm wiped out most of his ships off the coast of Dyrrhachium, which is in Albania today. There was also Godfrey of Bouillon. Godfrey of Bouillon, there we go. Godfrey of Bouillon and his brother Baldwin. These guys were direct descendants of Charlemagne. And for your information, Baldwin would eventually become the king of Jerusalem, but to say that, I'm jumping ahead. Godfrey's troops pillaged the countryside of Greece for 8 days. And this pillaging left a bad taste in the mouths of the olive-skinned locals, and it also contributed to the notion that Crusaders were, in people's minds especially today, evil and rapacious villains. Among still other princes leading their own respective armies was Bohemond of Taranto. Bohemond of Taranto, which is in northern France. Bohemond was a skilled military commander with an army of Norman knights. Just one of the things interesting to me about Bohemond was that he, with his father, had fought several battles against the Byzantine Christians in Sicily and southern Italy, and usually Bohemond won. Emperor Alexius of Constantinople, his daughter wrote of Bohemond, he was slender with very white skin. And there was a certain charm about him which was in contrast to a hard, savage quality. Even his laugh sounded like a threat to others. It was no wonder that Emperor Alexius was very apprehensive of the approach of Bohemond's army. And as we're going to see today, Emperor Alexius will be of little help in the siege of Jerusalem. On a more insidious, even infamous note, another German contingency of Crusaders was led by Amico of Flaunheim, that's in southwest Germany. Amico attacked a Jewish village named Speyer, set in the Rhine Valley. And learning that Amico's army, an army with bad intentions toward Jews, learning that that army was headed toward them, the town had already 2 weeks earlier encountered Peter the Hermit's army. The local Catholic bishop in Speyer took local Jews under his protection. Nevertheless, Amico's soldiers captured and murdered 12 Jews. Amico did the same thing again at Worms and 2 other cities on his way east. And as with Speyer, the Catholic bishops of the city sought to protect the Jews. Bribes of gold were even offered to Amico to leave the Jews alone. That didn't work. Even at the peril of their own bishops' lives, they tried to protect the Jews. The whole thing was horrid. And it's no wonder that historians tell the tales of German crusaders having captured and murdered a couple thousand Jews. As Amico headed east, Bulgaria would not allow him to enter. And if you can believe it, soon after that, Amico's army disbanded. He never even made it to the Holy Land. Scholars today argue, did Amico view Jews as enemies of the gospel? Was he fever-pitched with crusader spirit and sought to wipe out anyone who didn't confess Christ? Or was it greed? And if it was greed, why not go after non-Jews? Or, scholars wonder, was Amico just an anti-Semite? Well, there is no consensus. But this villain's actions helped to stain the reputation of all crusaders. Stephen Weidenkopf summarized the situation, quote, "The crusade thus divided into German, Italian, and French contingents, and each decided to follow its own objectives to the detriment of all." Close quote. One of the German contingents headed down to Jerusalem through Cappadocia, which is Turkey today. They decided to launch a raid against the city of Nicaea to get supplies. But the Turks there, having already suffered siege from a French army, were prepared the second go-around, and the Turks launched their own attack on the Germans. Having overwhelmed the Western invaders, the Turks offered the 200 German knights and 7,000 infantrymen the choice of converting to Islam or death. Of these German Christians, some chose Islam, the rest were executed. In all of this, there was no single leader, no single organizer, no 5-star General Patton. Yes, the Pope did send a legate, 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 ambassador, envoy, district superintendent. The Pope did send a legate to oversee the crusade, but in truth, the legate had little authority and did not issue any military commands. And frankly, my listener, this lack of leadership is one of the pitfalls that would constantly plague the Crusades. It's one thing to rally tens of thousands to go to war, right? It's another thing to fund and supply them. It's another thing to secure safe passage over the Mediterranean or through the Balkans, then through Turkey and down to Jerusalem. And it's still another thing entirely to have a military commander who can strategically oversee the entire endeavor. Alas, on this first crusade, the lack of leadership and foresight will eventually prove, as we're going to see, it's going to prove disastrous for the Holy Roman Empire Christians. And then, sheesh, owing to many factors, poor planning, battles with Hungarians and Albanians and Turks on the way down, causing starvation or even desertion. Yes, desertion. Traveling by foot for a couple thousand miles was brutal. By the time the varied, localized Catholic armies arrived outside Jerusalem, something like 88% of all the original soldiers had been lost. That's just amazing. The trip alone was brutal. And then, to make matters worse, the Byzantine Emperor Alexius of Constantinople had little interest in helping Catholics siege Jerusalem. Now it is true, yes, he had called for help. He asked the West for help against Islam. But he expected a bunch of loose bands of mercenaries to arrive, not full-fledged feudal armies. Moreover, Alexius was indifferent about Jerusalem. To him, Jerusalem was strategically irrelevant to his Eastern Orthodox Empire. Worse still, Alexius looked at the Catholic Crusaders as barbarians. But that suspicion wasn't one-sided. What was good for the goose was good for the gander. The Holy Roman Crusaders held that Byzantine Christians themselves were decadent, devious plotters, with Alexius himself being seen as a wretched emperor. And my listener, this East versus West suspicion, this Eastern Orthodox versus Roman Catholic bad will hampered most efforts over the centuries to forestall Muslim advancements into Christian lands. It's just the sad fact. Division and suspicion and even betrayal between Christians west and east helped eventually in 1453, that betrayal and suspicion helped the success of Muslim conquest of Constantinople. Oh, it just makes me pause to say, Christ-loving church, we have to stand together. All of that set up, let's now turn to the siege of Jerusalem proper. Let's go to the First Crusade. After fighting and defeating Muslims, with the help of miracles, because they saw apparitions of Christ and St. Andrew and other saints, and also with the help of actually retrieving the holy lance, they said, that pierced Christ's side, which they took as a sign of God's military presence and assurance. After fighting and defeating Muslim in the cities of Nicaea, Dorylaeum, again probably there in Croatia, Dorylaeum and Antioch, the Crusaders finally reached the walls of Jerusalem on June 7th, 1099. You guys, this means it was 3 full years since they had left home in Western Europe. 3 years. And I just got to interrupt the historical narrative for a moment. I don't think we are adept at getting our 21st century Western imaginations inside the effort, the existential commitment, the devotion even. Because remember, the Crusaders were indeed motivated by their yearn for spiritual blessing, forgiveness of all their sins, eternal life even. It's hard for us to get our imaginations inside the effort, the cost, the sacrifice that those men and peasant women and some young boys expended just to make it from Gaul to Jerusalem. They had a something, an internal fire, a deeply shared zeal. Yeah, it was a zeal, a corporate zeal that I don't believe I've ever experienced in my own life. Maybe I've sensed a tiny slice of that corporate commitment, fervor, resolve, stick-to-itiveness on some sports teams. That shared sense of burning purpose, of never giving up, of striving together, I don't know, but I believe the Crusaders had an internal fire. A fire they believed was from and for the glory of Christ. And that's why I think they were esteemed and why schools gave their mascots the name Crusaders and Knights over a few centuries. They were so esteemed for this kind of striving and sacrifice. But I don't think many Western Christians today experience that. I mean, I was a theology faculty member. I never felt it on my Christian college campus. I never experienced that among the theology faculty. I never sensed a corporate sense of fervor and sacrifice at all at my seminary. I've never felt or known that sort of unity of heart and drive and purpose at a local church. Never. But those Holy Roman Empire Christians, they had something. Man, I probably need to reflect on this still more in later shows. I think the medieval Christian ardor, zeal, passion for Christ, I think it clearly appeared in Western European towns and cities when they, taking centuries on end, built towering cathedrals to the glory of God. Holy shnikes! Entire towns, regions even, all given over to building a cathedral to honor Christ, doing that across centuries. Yeah, I say that we do not at all appreciate medieval Christianity or medieval Christians. Despite all that, and despite the Enlightenment taught us, Gersh, to call the medieval period the Dark Ages. Sheesh. Can you say 9? The Holy City was occupied by Arab and Egyptian Muslims for some 450 years. Bohemond, the most skilled of the Catholic generals, decided to stay behind and govern the recently conquered city of Antioch. The Crusaders took Antioch. Byzantine Emperor Alexius, in an act of betrayal, or maybe it was cowardice, maybe he feared future Muslim reprisals. Alexius had written the Muslim Prince of Cairo a letter repudiating any connection with Crusader advance on Jerusalem. And the governor in Jerusalem, Ifitkar, he was an Egyptian man, Ifitkar, he prepared for the oncoming siege variously by polluting the city's surrounding well water. He had all the livestock driven away. He had catapults built. And in what was a wise move for him, Ifitkar drove out Jerusalem's eastern Christian population. He had learned that the Christians over at Antioch had worked from inside the city walls to help the sieging Crusaders, and Ifitkar didn't want to repeat that mistake. But all of that, with his leadership, preparations were made for a long siege. But Ifitkar was also secretly hopeful. He'd been told that an overwhelming relief force would soon arrive. Outside Jerusalem's walls, some Crusader 10,000 infantry and 1,300 knights gathered. It wasn't a big army. Again, the number that was decimated from the original departure in the spring of 1096 was gruesome. But yes, on June 7, 1099, if you can believe it, it was a Wednesday. I went and looked at which day of the week that was. On June 7, 1099, the Crusaders attacked. And they enjoyed quick success, smashing through the city's outer defenses. But once they hit the city's 8-foot-thick walls, they stalled. Why? They didn't have sufficient ladders to scale the 40-foot-tall walls. Worse still, there were no materials available to build ladders. But to their good luck, or God's timing, 6 ships from Europe, 2 from Genoa and 4 from England, arrived. Not only did those ships have food supplies for the Crusaders, they also had cargoes of ropes, nails, and bolts, equipment necessary for sieging a city. And there they were in early June, and it was intensely hot. The Crusaders were suffering big numbers of desertions because the news of a huge Egyptian Muslim army moving up to rescue Jerusalem dampened previously hopeful hearts. But so enter medieval Roman Catholic religion. Scholars write that a priest received a vision that promised victory if the Crusaders stopped bickering among themselves, fasted, and walked barefoot around the walls of Jerusalem. The vision was accepted as authentic, and a 3-day fast was observed. Then on July 8, 1099, the procession began. Bishops, clergy, princes, knights, foot soldiers, and non-combatants, all of them barefoot, as they marched around the city. Muslim residents of Jerusalem crowded the walls to mock them. The procession ended on the Mount of Olives, where Peter the Hermit preached an impassioned sermon. For 2 subsequent days, the Crusaders built siege towers, filled in city ditches, we could think of them as moats, filled in those ditches with dirt so the towers could be rolled against the walls. When they finally did that, they could not get over the walls. There were too many Muslim soldiers fighting back. But with the help of crossbow squadrons who could, with the ability to fire quickly and with power, keep the walls clear of Muslim soldiers, they finally succeeded and set up ladders. Up and over the walls of Jerusalem, the Crusaders began fighting inside the city. Soon a massacre of Muslims began. Within a week, from July 8 to July 16, Jerusalem had been conquered and the city's residents and soldiers were massacred. And yes, we have to say it, it was a massacre. So you guys, folks, we should pause here. Let's reflect on medieval warfare. The rules went like this. A sieging army would propose terms of surrender to a city. If the city did not agree, then it was standard medieval practice for centuries on end over in Europe or here in the Middle East. The practice was that the city would, for not having originally surrendered, be massacred as a warning to those in the future. Now, remember my reflection of a couple weeks ago? How many people across history have had their lives wrecked by the decisions of leaders? How many citizens inside of cities would have surrendered and lived, but their leaders wouldn't, and so they were all massacred? Ugh. What the Crusaders did in Jerusalem was ugly. I wouldn't want to have witnessed it. I can't watch today videos of Muslims taking swords and cutting off people's heads. But as I noted for 5 prior shows, it was an invasion and massacre that was precipitated by 4.5 centuries of Muslim invasions and massacres, and desecration of monks and nuns and priests and white women, to point out a favored Muslim target from last week's show. Again, in prior centuries, Muslims had massacred dozens of Christian cities. Scholar Rodney Stark wrote, another rule of medieval war was to the victor goes the spoils. Loot and booty were major motivating factors of medieval warfare, especially for the common soldiers in all armies, close quote. Common soldiers who had sacrificed all the comforts of village life to go a-warring. Again, I'm not excusing the Crusader violence and massacre, but I am positing it within its 11th century context. We need to be careful, as I've said for several shows in a row, to not practice chronological snobbery. No one, Muslims, Christians, or any pagan tribal group, no one in the medieval era observed or could have even known about the Geneva Convention of Human War Games rules. No, we should probably address another secular spin on this First Crusade. The spin is that Crusaders massacred Jews in Jerusalem. The false narrative is that the Crusaders pursued all the Jews of Jerusalem into their synagogue, where then the Crusaders burned them alive and burned the synagogue down to the ground. But the truth is, there were Jews in the city who fought with Muslims. They were not innocent bystanders. But yes, as we saw earlier with Amico of Flaunheim, there was indeed an anti-Semitic thread, flavor, sentiment that ran through some of the Crusaders. The truth is, though, that most of the Jews of Jerusalem were spared. Scholars argue whether the burn down the synagogue story, burn all the Jews story is even true. Jews, we know from Jewish historians, were forced to carry corpses out of the city, so they were not all genocided, as the secular thread would happily have it. And then, what of the huge Egyptian Muslim army that was supposed to arrive and deliver Jerusalem from the Crusaders? Well, the Caliph of Egypt was tricked by Emperor Alexius of Constantinople. Alexius, as it turns out, was doing his dead-level best to coax and manipulate and game all the parties involved. Alexius told the Caliph that the Crusaders would negotiate with him. The Caliph, well, he held that for a while. When the Caliph took a 20,000-man army north toward Jerusalem, the Crusaders captured their immense herds that were brought to feed the Muslim army. In the early morning, the Crusaders formed up their ranks and advanced on the Caliph's military camp, and incredibly, they took the enemy completely by surprise. Once again, an arrogant Muslim leader had not even posted sentries, let alone sent out scouts. Oh, lack of leadership is such a crushing dynamic, you guys. The Muslims offered no sustained opposition and fled for their lives, but there were few survivors. The Muslim general managed to escape with a few of his officers by sailing away to Egypt. The Crusaders had captured Jerusalem and defeated the Caliph's forces. It was a totes surprising victory. Surprising because it took them 3 years to get down to the Holy Land, surprising because they were greatly outnumbered, and surprising because of all the obstacles they overcame throughout the journey and the battle. But get this, back to bad leadership? Scholar Rodney Stark writes, quote, "Within several months, the Crusader forces remaining in the Holy Land had fallen to perhaps no more than 300 knights and an unknown but not very large number of foot soldiers. Unfortunately, no plans had been made at the outset for maintaining a liberated Jerusalem because it was thought that the Byzantines would take the lead." Close quote. But that was not the case. The Crusaders were abandoned by the Byzantine Empire. Worse still, as it turned out, Emperor Alexius was willing to return Jerusalem back to the Muslims if the terms of such an agreement were fiscally satisfying enough. So we have to ask, was the First Crusade a success? Well, yes, Jerusalem had returned to Christian hands, but they didn't have a long-term plan for what they'd do once they seized Jerusalem. And as we'll see later, in later episodes, that failure to plan, that lack of leadership, lack of foresight and planning, that'll eventually lead to the need for still more crusades. Oh my goodness, it reminds me of a Seinfeld episode. Seinfeld, Jerry's at a rental car agency, but the car he reserved is no longer available. So he says to the woman behind the counter, "I don't understand. I made a reservation. The reservation keeps the car here." The rental car woman says, "I know why we have a reservation." Jerry says, "I don't think you do, or I'd have a car. You see, you know how to take the reservation, but you don't know how to hold the reservation. And that's really the most important part of a reservation, the holding." And the Crusaders, they hadn't planned how to hold Jerusalem. Oh man. So the notion that the First Crusade was some kind of abomination, it just doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Just like the Crusaders' ability to hold Jerusalem wouldn't finally hold up under Muslim scrutiny. Oh, thanks for thinking with me today. Thanks for processing a little more carefully with me today. It's an honor to have you with me. Please, until next week, everyone go and turn on your beautiful God-given brain.